Before the break, we were talking about why we see a banking crisis and using Silicon Valley Bank as the example. So far, we've covered how SVB was hurt, 1, by inflation and interest rates, 2, by the risks of fractional banking, and 3, by the whole woke culture. Now let's look at the other 2 problems that added to their perfect storm. The 4th factor with SVB has to do with FDIC coverage of deposits. Before 2008, the FDIC would guarantee up to $100,000 on deposit in any insured bank. But during the financial crisis of 2008, they raised that amount to $250,000. But in SVB's case, that's a pittance. They had tech companies depositing $100 million into their accounts. And those tech companies felt safe. The money was held in treasury bonds. But the bank run was caused by depositors realizing that they weren't covered 100%. If you had $100 million in the bank and you realized that you might not get back $99,750,000, then you rushed to get your money out, and the bank failed. Very quickly, the federal government stepped in and said 100% of all deposits would be covered in this bank. Now, had they said that before the bank run, there might never have been a crisis. But they didn't, and thus they closed Silicon Valley Bank. There are a couple of problems with things that happened. First, it's not entirely clear the government can do what they did. They promised to cover 100% of 2 banks, but not all banks. Is that fair? And despite President Biden's pinky promise that no taxpayer money would be used to bail out these banks, we don't see how that's entirely possible. The FDIC reserves have limits, and Silicon Valley Bank alone could require more than $100 billion from the reserve fund. Here's a chart from our friend John Malden that he shared in a recent letter to clients. It shows a whopping 94% of SVB Bank domestic deposits were uninsured at the end of 2022. But SVB, not alone. There are many other bigger and better-known banks that are on this list, but here's the difference. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has now said in advance that the big systemic banks will be 100% covered. That's why there's been such a rush from depositors to move their banks from small banks to big banks. This puts smaller banks at risk. Who wants to keep their money in a smaller bank that may not be 100% covered? Do you see the moral hazard? As a result, ironically, FDIC insurance, because it's nebulous on what's actually covered, has added to the uncertainty. Now, the 5th and the final factor may have been economic warfare, both foreign and domestic. Yes, just as we saw financial terrorism involved in the 2008 collapse, we see signals that it may be happening again. In terms of foreign economic warfare, we know both China and Russia have been on the warpath. Let's be clear. Silicon Valley Bank appeared to have a good working relationship with Chinese startups, and they had a branch in China. At first glance, it would not seem to be in China's interest to let this bank fail. But if you dig deeper, you realize that an attack on SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, could be very much in line with an unrestricted warfare strategy. That's their 1999 How to Destroy a Superpower Handbook. It talks a lot about financial warfare. It talks about causing bank runs and stock market crashes. And China's spy agency is more than capable of starting rumors that could spark such a run. In fact, China had their own bank runs last year. We know China is getting on a war footing. How better to hurt America than starting a banking crisis? Now, I have no definitive proof that I've seen, but this can't be ruled out. And what better way to double whammy America? You hit the bank that funds our tech industry while you also cause a financial panic. And we know that our adversaries will wait for the time to be right with rising interest rates to exploit the inherent risks of fractional banking. Now, on the domestic front, we've already explained how the progressive left has planned to use a banking crisis to usher in the Great Reset. This was episode 179. It aired in March of 2022. It was titled, Are You Ready for the Next Crisis? Just think about how this empowers the Great Reset. It gives an excuse to nationalize the banks, and it also allows the government to pick and choose among which depositors it protects for anything over the FDIC limits.